Okay, well this is the shutter out of a Retina Ia camera. This camera's here for a complete service. I can tell from looking at the lens that someone has had a go at moving that with some sort of tool. You don't want to use any sort of pointed tool or metal tool to get that lens loose. If it won't come loose with your fingers, you need to use a friction tool. Something like this. Sometimes you have to push quite hard to get that lens free, but it avoids putting all those scratches into the lens. So I'll pop that aside safely. Here's a little spacer ring. That doesn't serve to space the lens from the body. It is just a dress ring really, but it should be present. That's very buckled. I'll have to straighten that up. Someone's done cruel things to that, which is on par with the rest of this job. Right, the lens at the back, same story. Ideally use a friction tool. If you don't have one or can't seem to achieve it, use a 6-inch rule like this. Make sure it doesn't contact the rear glass. It doesn't in this case, but you always need to make sure of that. Put it into the slot on the back of the lens and use that to break the thing free. If you ever strike a lens that is really tight and you can't get it loose that way, you can put your rule down in a vise so you only have perhaps 1 millimetre of the edge showing above the top. Then you can hold your shutter down on it with the lens so that the slots in the lens pick up the rule, and then you can twist the whole body of the shutter, and that's a very good way to get things like that loose. Okay, so here we've got the back of the shutter showing, and we might as well remove this. 2 screws, one here. Where's my tweezers? There they are. One here. Now the back of this, I'll pop those screws away carefully. This looks slightly distorted here, which could... This was a camera that somebody forced the lens and shutter out of, so that would go with it. I've got to disconnect the flash connection now. That's this very small screw here. Give it a turn or so, prise that wire out. We can take the rear body off. There's the curved rack that cocks the shutter. This piece that you saw spring out, that provides the detent, the clicks for the aperture settings. And then we can get the rest of the thing apart. So back to the front. This is locked in here with a screw. You need a special screwdriver to deal with that. I've got one here that I've made. It was a nice broad screwdriver. What's that, about 4mm, 5mm? And then I just filed the tip of it to suit. Let's find my glasses. So rotate that screw till the flat side is to the centre. That whole front ring, then you can rotate it until it reaches the stops and peel that off. Here's your speed setting ring here. That should just lift off. Put that one to one side. you got a spring here, very fine hair spring, that controls the latch. It holds the shutter in the cocked position, so release that from the end and it just drops back against the body. This spring here is the main spring that drives the shutter. Unhook that from its post and you should be able to lift off this main drive ring complete. Here's the shutter release lever. It's not as bent as I thought it would be. That pin's a little bit off 90 degrees. This is mostly the sync mechanism, looks after the flash sync. I'll swing this lever across, which brings it into the cocked position. Lift that spring off its tab there, let it rest back against the body. Remove this screw. The screw should come off complete with its spring. This is the B lever. That holds the shutter open on the B setting. 2 more screws. This one holds the green lever in. The green lever changes the flash sync from M, which is for bulb flash, to X, which is for electronic flash. In the bulb flash position, effectively what happens is that the flash contacts make before the shutter starts to move, and that is intended to give the flash bulb time to reach peak brilliance before the exposure is made. Electronic flash is, for practical purposes, instantaneous, so the flash is fired. That's the phone. I'll be back in a minute. Back to business. That was just someone ringing me about their computer problem that they don't have anymore. Right, lift this cover off. Here are the flash sync bits and pieces. 2 of these little brass standoffs or spacers, they can come out. This spring is what effectively drives the flash sync mechanism. Lift it off its post at this end. Swing that out of the way, move this lever, lift that off. This is 2 pieces. This tiny tab you see at the top is actually only held in place with a spring. I'll show you that another day. It's fun putting that back together. Here we've got a little tab. This is the pallet. Now I'll just run this manually. Let's just do this. We'll leave that in there for the moment. I'll show you what happens. Basically, when you release the shutter, that lever we just had there drives this, which swings this pallet wheel across, which rattles the pallet backwards and forwards, which effectively adds a delay. And that's what gives you the delay before the shutter actually releases. And take that pallet out. Here's your flash. This is the lever that works off there, and this is the other end of it, works on this flash contact here. Single screw for that. Just pull that out. You'd be carefully putting these screws aside so you know exactly where they came from. There's your flash contact. This is 2 pieces. It just slides together. Have a close look at that another time. That's always fun. This spring here, that drives the highest speed, the 1/500th speed. That's an extra spring that's brought into play just for doing that speed. We'll take that little wheel out. Here we have the flash sink post. This is plastic. It's an acrylic, I think. It's extremely vulnerable to solvent. Don't splash any solvent around in one of these shutters while that thing's present. It goes all gooey and falls to bits. Held by a single brass screw. I think some shutters that screw might be black. I'll remove the screw from the case here now. That was the flash, that held the flash sink wire in place. That's a very small black screw, but that is not the smallest component. Gently see if that flash sink will pop out of the case, and in this case it did. Sometimes it won't. There's a little brass contact which fits underneath it. I told you there was a small part in the shutter, and it's a tiny insulating plastic slug which goes between that screw that holds the wire in for the flash and the connection itself. And that's so that you don't, there's that component. I've got it out. You might not be able to see that. That's probably about less than 1 millimetre in width and diameter. Let's have a quick look. Yeah. These are millimetres. So it's about 3/4 of a millimetre wide, 1 millimetre in length. That's a plastic slug. Try not to lose that. You can use other things instead, but it's best if you've got the original part. Back to the shutter. Alright, so we've got everything we need to take off the top there. We can flip it over. If that flash contact had been reluctant to fall out when you pushed it from the back here, the next trick you'd do would be to loosen these screws up slightly. There's 3 screws on the back of the case, and that would just give you enough rattle at this position for that flash contact to come out. Anyway, we can remove these 3 screws. You be carefully putting them aside, noting where they came from. I haven't looked to see if my camera's recording. I'll be very disappointed if it isn't. I'll have to do all this again. Right, so we'll just separate those 2 halves of the shutter. Here's our shutter case. The shutter case holds the aperture or diaphragm. And this one looks pretty scungy, but there's a little bit of oil and dirt on it. There's not an awful lot you can practically do to make those blades look pretty. You can clean them with solvent, that's about your lot. You need to be fairly cautious with them, because if you bend them in any way, and they're easily bent, then they're very hard to put back together. So we'll pop that aside for the moment. Here's the shutter half of the case. The shutter blades just lay one on top of each other. the first blade, the lowest blade you see here, it goes here, that's distinguished. It has an extra hole here. I'm not sure why they bothered to do that. That always goes in this position. There's your retard speed train over here. There's a big rivet head right there. So it's the second position. There's the position next to the end of the retard gear train. Here's the next position, and that's where that blade goes. So here's blade 5, the last one that went on. Blade 4, blade 3. And you can see those blades wanted to come out together. It means they're sticky with oil. Sometimes all 5 blades will lift out as one piece, and the shutter that really needs to be cleaned. Right, so I'll pop those blades to one side, and I'll do that by tipping them into a container. And then we need to do more work on this shutter. I'm going to unhook this spring. That's the return spring for that whole actuating ring, blade actuating ring there. A single screw here. And it looks like there's a washer under there. That's a bit unusual. We'll keep that in mind. You probably won't find a washer there. That can come off. I leave the retard gear train alone. I leave that on there. Unless there's a special need to, it doesn't pay to remove that from the base plate to clean, because it is very, very difficult to get the speeds set correctly afterwards. It's better to clean it on the plate and then deal with it later. 1, 2, 3 screws hold this plate on, or 4 screws on this shutter. It's really on some of the earlier cameras. These will be Loctited in place. You need a good screwdriver, lots of pressure so you don't slip, and those screws will come out. They're short, 3 of them are short, 1 of them's long. They are stuck in very, very well. That's the long one. I'll pop that lot aside over in that container. Here we see that plate, the blade actuating ring and the main mechanism plate, and that's as far as that gets taken down. Let's have a look at the aperture next. I'll be back in a minute. Right, to strip down the diaphragm, you'll see there's a little notch in the plate here, both sides. Now that can be lined up with 2 screw heads. Those screw heads hold this lever on. That allows you to adjust the aperture. So expose those 2 screw heads and unscrew those 2 screws. The lever should drop away, as it does. And our 2 screws are just sitting in here. Let's get them loose. Shake them out. They're fairly distinctive. Don't lose them, you won't find anything else much like them. Back over here. Alright, 3 screws. One of them is a countersunk head screw. You'll see that fits down into a recess in that plate. The other 2 are not. Take those screws out. We can tip the diaphragm out. That's it. That's the control ring. That's the piece that's rotated backwards and forwards by the lever. Here are our blades, all neatly interwoven, and there's the main plate. Those pieces all need to be cleaned, and that's the next task. Thank you.